1 minute until showtime.
Whoops.
Your show will go live in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Blog Talk Radio.
All right, welcome everybody to Yaron Brook Show number 6, Yaron's News Briefing episode 6. Thank you all for hanging in there with me as we do these shows. I know I'm supposed to reconsider the name and come up with a new name, but it's just life's been too busy, and today was the first day since my back surgery that I was driving around and kind of going. Went to the Einstein Institute, to the office, meetings and stuff like that. So it's been a long and busy day already. Haven't had time to look at the names. I hope this weekend to have time. We will see. Lots going on. Lots going on in Yaron Brook's life. Hopefully a lot going on in your life, and hopefully it's overwhelmingly good stuff. So welcome. Of course, you can call in with any questions you like on the news of the day or just generally questions, 347-324-3075. Love to chat with my listeners here, particularly if you're young, particularly if you're new to these ideas. You guys inspire me, so I'd love to hear from you, 347-324-3075. And of course, don't forget, once you dial in and you're hooked in, press 1. So... cool. Let's see. So we've got a bunch of stuff to talk about today. Try to go through some of these issues quickly. I think we went into quite in depth yesterday about the stock market issue, and more importantly, doing research and being first-handed in your own thinking. That was the important point yesterday. So if you haven't heard yesterday's show, Yaron's News Briefing episode 5, go back and listen to it. I think it was pretty good, and I think I had a lot of good tips there for people and a lot of encouragement to really be first-handed in your thinking, not to be second-handed and not to be superficial, as too many I find today, particularly on the web, indeed are. All right, we're on YouTube, Facebook, Blog Talk, and I think even Periscope. So I think we're also on Periscope, so you can listen from anywhere. Okay, a few things. Let's start. Might as well start. These some stuff I actually picked up yesterday and never got to cover. But I want to start with Putin. Putin, president of Russia, of the Russian Federation, there was some question about whether he would run, or some people had question about whether he would run again for president, as if he actually has to run for president, whether he would allow himself to be crowned as president for another 4-6 years, whatever the level is in Russia. And yes, he is. He's going to, surprise. I was indeed, I mean, how could Eddie be shocked? The guy is an authoritarian, basically a dictator. And yes, he's going to go for another term. He's going to rig another election, although I don't think he needs to rig it. I think the Russians will actually vote him in. They love authoritarians. I don't know if I told you the story, but last time I was in Moscow, I was staying at a hotel right across the street from Red Square, and right next to Red Square, there's this mall, really, really, really nice mall. It's kind of funny, this mall right next to the symbol, Red Square, the symbol of communism. And in this mall, I found a man dressed up like Stalin, standing there and getting photos with people, and people like excited to get photographed with Stalin. I don't know. Russia is not a good place. Anyway, Putin is going to be president of Russia for the foreseeable future, maybe for the rest of our lifetimes. He's still fairly young, and he's going to rule over Russia for a very, very, very long time. And why not? I mean, it's been very, very lucrative. There are people out there who would argue that he might be the richest man in the world if you consider the amount of money stashed away in a variety of different offshore bank accounts. Basically money he's stolen because he's a politician after all. Politicians don't engage in productive activity. Politicians should never be rich as a consequence of politics. So politicians who've been politicians their whole lives should never be rich, and yet many of them are, interestingly enough. He is one of them. He's a crook, he's a thief, but he's going to be president of Russia for the rest of our lives, and he's winning these days. He took credit for defeating ISIS in Syria. The Assad regime has won in Syria with the Russian backing, and in the news, I think today or yesterday, was the fact that Putin is putting together a bill to build a massive new port or expand the existing port the Russian Navy has in Syria. They're going to build a massive new port in Syria. I've always argued that the main reason that Putin got engaged in Syria, the main reason Putin, was so insistent on Assad winning in Syria was in order to protect his interest in a warm water port. So Russia has always wanted a warm water port. The ports in the north of Russia often freeze over. He wanted a port on the Mediterranean that gives him strategic access to Europe, to Northern Africa, to the Middle East with all its oil. And he's got one. He's had one in Syria for many decades. But now that Assad has won, now that he's kind of solidified the Assad regime there, he's investing heavily in a new state-of-the-art, massive new port on the Mediterranean for the Russian fleet to have its home. The U.S. has a sixth fleet in the Mediterranean, and the Russians want to equal it. So Putin, things are going his way. Nobody's challenged him on Ukraine. All the sanctions have not really hurt him that much. He's still struggling, Russia economy, and Putin is still struggling from low energy prices, from the low price of oil and the low price of natural gas. But the Russian people love an authoritarian. The Russian people love a strong man. The Russian people love winners, to quote Donald Trump. And they will keep him in power for as long as he wants. And indeed, he has been strong. Michael on YouTube says, Yaron, hopefully Assad regime won. The alternative was Islamist. Yeah, but the alternative was the continued civil war. I would have liked the civil war to continue forever. I don't see why any one of them has to win. I think there are massive advantages to having civil wars in places like Syria, where the Shiite radicals are fighting the Sunni radicals. And by the way, I'm not convinced that an Islamist Sunni victory would have been better. If you look about who the real winners are, it's not Assad in Syria. The real winner in Syria is Iran. Iran will now have a forward military base on the Israeli border, on the Golan Plateau, on the Golan Heights Plateau. So within striking distance of Israel, if they bring in some of their more longer-range missile technologies, they will be in striking distance of the entire state of Israel. So from Israel's perspective, Assad winning the way he won with Russian and Iranian, particularly Iranian backing, was a worst case scenario. Worst case scenario, much worse than if ISIS had occupied that territory. ISIS does not have the resources to threaten Israel. Iran, particularly post-sanctions, Iran does. Iran has massive resources, a sophisticated military, and sophisticated weaponry. Again, I don't think they're a real threat to Israel with conventional weapons, because I think Israel could crush them. But they, not a threat to destroy Israel, but a threat to inflict massive casualties in Israel, absolutely, and a threat to force Israel to invest heavily in its own security, more heavily than it has in the past, absolutely. So I think the superficial view that Assad's victory is good because the Islamists didn't win, I think is a mistake. I think that this is, in many respects, this is a worst case scenario. The idea, and that is a victory for the, for the Iranians. The real importance of the Golan Heights is that it overlooks much of northern Israel. It is high up. There are steep. Steep slopes going down into a valley where the Sea of Galilee is, where Jesus walked on water, and from there it is relatively easy passage to Israeli population centers. Controlling the Golan Heights gives you an incredible strategic advantage in terms of Israel. So the fact that the Iranians are going to have the potential of having access to the Golan Heights. Now, they because Israel has that portion of the Golan, they're not on the slope, but they could get there very quickly. In 1973, in the Yom Kippur War, within the first 24 hours, the Syrians were at the bottom of the slopes. They were heading towards the Israeli population centers. Israel had lost the war. And one of the things that happened is that the Syrians were convinced that this couldn't be the case, that this couldn't be true, and they stopped, which allowed the Israeli reserves to mount a counteroffensive and basically crush the Syrians. Israel was on the brink of defeat in 1973. Indeed, they had their nuclear arsenal in the air, ready to strike. We probably came closest to ever, probably more so than in the Cuban crisis. We probably came closest to a nuclear bomb being exploded over one of those Arab countries, closer in 1973 during the war than in any other time since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Israelis literally had the nukes in their planes, up in the air, circling, waiting for words. So the Golan Heights is crucial, and now the Iranians are there. So no, this is not a good outcome for anybody. So and the Russians, huge advantage for the Russians, huge advantage for Hezbollah, a terrorist organization in the north of Israel, huge advantage for Iran, and of course, a massive disadvantage for Israel in the United States. So I see a lot of problems coming out of the Middle East in the decades to come as a consequence of really of the last 17 years, the last 30 years, since 1979, of American foreign policy. Just disastrous foreign policy, almost 40 years of American disastrous foreign policy under Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and now Donald Trump. All basically same weak, compromising foreign policy. All right, let's see. We're gonna take a quick call before I get to at least two other topics today. I want to cover the Federal Reserve raising rates yesterday, and Donald Trump's announcement today that he is going to roll back regulations to 1960 levels. We'll talk about both those things later on. Hi, you're on the Yaron Brook Show. Who's this?
Is it me?
Yes, it's you.
Oh, hey, it's Michael again.
Hey, Michael. How's it going?
And I hate to take you off your stride again and talk to you about something else. Are you open to other topics?
I am. Go ahead.
Maybe you heard today, but net neutrality is almost repealed.
Yep.
The regulations was repealed by FCC, and I actually think it's a good thing. I'm one of the few Americans that thinks it's a good thing.
Yep.
I wanted to make a quick case for why I think it's a good thing, and then maybe you could articulate it better since you are way more gifted verbally than I am, because I don't see how people are missing this.
Sure, do it quickly, but because I've talked about this before, so I've already done shows on this, but go ahead.
Okay, well, I mean, now you can, but they say that Google, YouTube, and AT&T are going to start throttling content, except they supported net neutrality. And the basic concept, the metaphor that I use is Verizon owns its own towers, U.S. Cellular owns its own towers, AT&T owns its own towers. The government isn't telling them what to do with their towers. How come Verizon lets people call people on U.S. Cellular and then on AT&T and on landlines? They own the towers. Couldn't they just throttle that and say,
Sure.
No, you can only call people who are Verizon? The reason they don't do that is because it's more beneficial to serve as many people as you can to increase the supply, right? To talk more on the Chicago side, like supply side economics.
Sure.
But that's my whole contention with it. It goes against natural principles and market theory.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, not necessarily for those reasons. My simple argument is this. I'm against regulations. I'm against government telling businesses how to run their businesses. I'm against the government telling AT&T and Verizon and Google and satellite providers and anybody who provides internet service. I'm against them telling them how to price their service, how to run their service, who to prefer over whom. They have the right to use their equipment, to use their wires, to use their cables any way they see fit. As long as they're not committing fraud, it's their business. Now, there is a sense in which regulations today protect, particularly the last mile providers of internet service, and grant them, I wouldn't say monopoly power, but oversized market power. I agree with that. That's true. And the argument is net neutrality at least prevents them from abusing their so-called monopoly power. My argument is the solution to their last mile market power is deregulate that as well. Keep going. Don't stop with net neutrality. Go all the way. Allow for free-for-all competition over internet access for all. Allow satellite companies and wireless internet companies of all kinds and cable companies and DSL companies and fiber companies and new things that we can't even imagine would exist. Allow them all to compete to provide us with internet service. Get out of the way, government. Leave us alone, government. So this is the point. And this is the principle that should apply to all regulation. You don't solve a problem created by regulations with more regulations. Let me repeat that because this is worth quoting. Somebody should turn this into a meme. You don't solve a problem, an economic problem created by regulations, by adding on regulations, by additional regulations. So if there's a last mile provider problem, the solution to that is not more regulations. The solution to that are more regulations of higher up on the pipeline, if they will, the regulations of net neutrality. The solution is deregulate everything. Deregulate the last mile. Deregulate telecom. Get the government out completely, 100% out of the telecom industry. That's my solution.
Can I say just one more thing?
Absolutely.
And something to think about is this is a unique thing because unlike materials for like tires and stuff like that, the internet, ISPs, is basically an infinite product. There's no scarcity of goods to create more ISPs. So if you lower the barrier of entry, i.e. take away regulations, you broaden the market and you get a more vibrancy of choice. Am I right on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Now, I don't know exactly what it means by SPs, but let's not get technical because that's where you will lose me and I'll lose everybody else. But yes, I agree. I agree with you. There's no, and of course we don't know what the future of the internet is, and the idea again that the FCC can centrally plan these kind of things. Let's see competition. Why not force Verizon to pay more to who do I get? I get my internet from Cox Cable. Why shouldn't Netflix have to pay Cox more money in order for Cox to provide them with a broader pipeline into my home than my website, which it doesn't eat up any bandwidth? So I should be really, really cheap, and Netflix, who wants to pump huge quantities of data through Cox's pipeline, will pay more money. I mean, it's absurd to me that anybody would think there's anything wrong with it.
Well, see, the reason, this is the last thing I'll say, I'll let you go. The reason I use the U.S. Cellular and Verizon like telephone services is because that's something that already exists.
Yeah.
And, you know, people don't realize this. Like, they could actually, if they really wanted to, Verizon could actually make it to where you could only, if you have a Verizon phone, you only call people who have Verizon phones. But they don't do that.
Because it's not in their interest to do that. That's right. That's right.
Exactly.
But the point is that even if they did, like some of the texting apps that I have, you can only text, like WhatsApp. You can only text with people who have a WhatsApp app, right? You can't text it to people who have iMessenger. Okay, so what? So the market will deal with that. That's what competition is about. That's what the market deal with it. Somebody wrote here, but Yaron, can we trust the providers of the market? Who else are you going to trust? Are you going to trust the FCC? You're going to trust the Trump administration? You're going to trust the Obama administration? You're going to trust Elizabeth Warren's administration? Who would you rather trust? I would much rather trust markets and competition. And some providers are going to make mistakes. They're going to have bad business models. They're going to throttle certain traffic. It'll be a disaster. They will lose market share, and they will be crushed by the marketplace. That's the beauty of it. Winners, if you have a winning business strategy, you win. You have a losing business strategy, you lose. But when the government does it, they know, that's it. There's no competition. There's no ability for the marketplace to figure out what's a winning strategy, what's a losing strategy. There's only the strategy approved by the bureaucrats, and that's wrong. All right?
Yeah.
Cool.
I just remembered something real quick.
Go ahead.
I like telling people this because over the years, everybody kept saying stuff like, Spencer's is going to be a monopoly. Like in the 40s, they were like, Spencer's is going to be a monopoly. Sure. And then Sears came over and outcompeted them.
Yep.
And then they said Sears was going to be a monopoly.
Yep.
And then Kmart outcompeted them. And they said Kmart's going to be a monopoly. And then Walmart outcompeted them. And now we're starting to see Amazon outcompete Walmart. Exactly.
And who's going to outcompete Amazon down the road? And who outcompeted IBM? And who outcompeted Rockefeller? Every single time they've claimed there's a monopoly, competition arose to that monopoly. When you allow the market to do it. And the way to allow the market to do it is to reduce regulations, not increase them. Right. All right, great topic, Michael. Thanks for calling. Really appreciate it. Now, I see I've got a couple of people who've called in. But again, if you want to ask a question, you have to press 1 on your dial, 1, so that I know you want to ask a question. I've got an 847 area code and a 954 area code. If you want to ask a question, press 1 on your phone so I know that that's what you want. All right, since we're talking about net neutrality and you're talking about regulation, let's talk about this I guess it wasn't a press conference. I guess it was just a speech by Donald Trump, a scripted speech. He was unscripted. He wasn't ad hoc. He claimed that he was going to reduce regulations to 1960s levels. And he had a pile of papers to illustrate this. In 1960, there were 20,000 pages of regulation. And today we have 185,000 pages of regulation. And touting the fact that I think they've eliminated 185 regulations and only introduced 5 new ones or something like that. I think 22 they've eliminated, and one for every one they've added. I would add that based on the little research I did, many of the 185 regulations they've eliminated were kind of old, borderline, unimportant regulations. But, they've eliminated regulations. 185 is not a huge number, but it's good. And they haven't added a lot of regulations, which is even better. But he is saying they're going to reduce it to 1960s. Now, the woman who's in charge of reducing regulations, I think her name is Pao, P-A-O, was asked, is this realistic? And she actually came on and said, well, no, it's only possible if Congress steps in and actually passes legislation that eliminates regulations. Now, that is incredibly unlikely, because to do that, the Senate would need 60 votes, which they don't have. The Republicans don't have 60 votes, no way close to that. So it's actually probably impossible for Donald Trump to actually reduce regulations in the 1960s without actually passing legislation. And what I've said in the past, and I think this is crucial, to really reduce regulations in a sustainable way, in the long run, so that it stays low, you have to pass legislations. You have to pass laws. This was what was done in the 1970s and the massive deregulations under Jimmy Carter. And by the way, Jimmy Carter was probably the most deregulation president ever. Again, a Democrat, surprising, a president we love to hate, and certainly love to hate him for a variety of reasons, but on regulations, for a variety of reasons, he deregulated. When you talk about trucking deregulations and airline deregulations and even some of the financial broker deregulations, it was Jimmy Carter. And then Ronald Reagan continued some of that. But to really do it, you have to do it through legislation, which is what he did in Carter's era, and in, I think to some extent under Reagan, it was through legislation. Because otherwise, when a Democrat becomes president and appoints people to regulatory agencies, they'll just reverse everything the Republicans have done. So the best thing is to have a law that says we're dismantling the FAA or the FDA, or we're reducing the scope of their regulatory authority, or we're making it. But those kind of laws are not going to be passed without a major revolution in this country. And Trump can't do it even if he wanted to, and I'm not sure he wants to. So reducing regulations to 1960s level is just him doing good marketing as usual, mouthing off, saying stuff that he knows is not going to be true, but that doesn't matter to him. I don't think Trump cares about the falsehood or the truth of any statement he makes, and this is a good example of it. To the extent that he is advocating for and working towards deregulation, good. I'm all for it. This woman who is in charge of kind of the deregulation push, her name is Pao. I know people who know her. She's very good. She's likely to do a good job within the limited capacity and scope of what she can do. It is likely that they actually will reduce regulations. By the way, under Jimmy Carter, Congress did facilitate reducing regulations back then. They managed to convince Democrats to vote for that. The same thing happened under Reagan. So, and the same thing happened under Bill Clinton, who did away with part of Glass-Steagall. So the idea that you can't convince some Democrats to vote for deregulation is wrong. But there's no attempt today because, again, our politics have become completely tribal, complete tribalism. You would never think of approaching Democrats about this, and Democrats would never think of voting with Republicans because it's completely, they don't come together even on stuff that maybe they could agree. I have no doubt that if the whole tax regime, tax reduction had been structured differently, had been presented differently, had been worked on differently, that some Democrats would have voted for it. But the way it is today, that there's no way for that to happen. All right, so deregulation, Trump today, good. As I've said in the past, Trump has actually appointed some really good people to head some of the regulatory agencies. He's appointed some good people to head the deregulation office at the White House. And I think those efforts are good and they're working forward. As I did point out at the Treasury Department, Mnuchin's department, they've got some really bad people there. They've got some real statists there who are advocating for expanding regulatory power for the federal government, not shrinking it. All right. By the way, if you want to call in, we've got another about 10 minutes or so, 347-324-3075. And you can ask me about anything pretty much, 347-324-3075. And after you've called in, press 1 so that I know you're calling in. Oh, you know what? I'm supposed to take breaks, and I forgot to do it. So let me take a quick one right now. We will be right back after this.
If you're interested in going deeper into Objectivism, ARI Campus's new advanced course, Objectivism Through Induction, answers central questions about several key values of Ayn Rand's revolutionary philosophy. Originally given by Leonard Peikoff in 1997, the course teaches you the method of learning Objectivism's principles that Rand used to discover them. According to Dr. Peikoff, Objectivism Through Induction is the best way I know of tying your ideas to reality and acquiring a real understanding of Objectivism. Visit ARI Campus today to enroll.
Yeah, I talked about this yesterday, about this idea of really to understand Objectivism, you have to tie it into reality. You have to tie it to the concretes in reality. You have to be able to reduce it to the concretes. And then also, and this is the induction part, you have to be able to at least understand the process of looking at the different concretes in reality and abstracting up to a principle, to an idea. So I encourage you all to go listen. I was there live when Dr. Peikoff gave the course on Objectivism Through Induction. Unbelievable content. If you think you know Objectivism, you take that course, you'll realize how little you know, particularly if you try to do the homework, which is really, really, really hard. So I would, you don't have to do the homework. So it's just the homework he announces during the course. But I really encourage you to go and do it. Try to do the homework and then see how Leonard Peikoff answers the question, answers the homework in a sense. You'll be blown away by his brilliance and by how much there is more to learn in Objectivism for you, for everybody, for me, for everyone. Again, if you want to ask a question, call it in. Much easier, much better, much easier for me to respond than if you just ask it on one of the chats. It's hard for me to follow, and you're much more likely to get your question asked and answered if you call in 347-324-3075. Stop being shy. Nothing to be shy about. Call in, press 1 once you get the line, and I will take you in. Right now, I do not have anybody calling in for a question. The lines are clear, so if you call in right now, you will be the first one whose question I will answer. All right, in the last 10 minutes or so that we've got here, and unless we have some questions, I want to talk about the Fed lifting rates yesterday. We got a slight rate increase, another, I think, quarter point. And this is the rate. I mean, really, the only meaningful rate that the Fed increases these days is the rate that they pay banks on the reserves that the banks hold. And that rate was increased by a quarter point. Basically, the idea is this is all to try to reduce the amount of money flowing in the economy, which is meant to reduce the amount of price inflation in the economy. By the way, induction is not just the basis of Objectivism. Induction is the basis of all new knowledge. All scientific knowledge is based on induction. All new knowledge in any field comes from induction. All right, back to the Fed. They're worried about inflation down the road, although price inflation. When I talk about inflation in the context we're talking about right now, we're talking about price inflation. Technically, inflation is the printing of money. But right now, let's talk about just price inflation, which is not the printing of money, but it is the the rising of prices. Prices are now rising very fast, well under 2%, which is the goal of the Fed. The Fed also announced that their long-term projected growth rate for the U.S. economy is 1.8%, which is pretty pathetic. That is consistent with what's called secular stagnation. That is a really, really, really low rate. Luckily, over the last 100 years, we have grown at significantly higher than that, at least 1 to 1.5% higher. At a 1.8% growth rate over the last 100 years, we would be a lot poorer than we are today. Now, I don't have time right now to get into the entire complexity of what the Fed is doing and not doing, because it's not doing much. But they're worried. They believe that fast economic growth results in inflation, and that the way to fight inflation is by raising interest rates. None of that is true. None of that is actually true. But that's what they believe. And that's the basis by which they are functioning. The new president, the new chairman of the Fed, is a fellow traveler to Janet Yellen. He was appointed by Donald Trump. He's a nothing. He's a consensus builder, and he is likely to continue this Keynesian, BS economics view of the relationship between growth, inflation, and interest rates. Completely wrong. No basis in actual economics. No basis in actual economics. So the Fed raised interest rates. Let me just say that my opinion on the Fed raising interest rates is I don't have one. I have no idea what the Fed is doing. I don't think the Fed has any idea what it's doing. And I don't think the Fed can have a good policy. It can have better policies. A better policy would be what's called a rule-based policy, which would be to link interest rates or the money supply to the price of gold, or to some kind of formula that the market is familiar with and everybody knows what it is. The Fed policy today is called discretionary policy. In other words, they can do whatever the hell they want, whenever the hell they want to do it. It's meaningless. But the deeper point I want to make is that the Fed is just a central planner trying to dictate market prices. As such, it is always wrong. Central planners, the price they set is always wrong because it's not a market price. Only markets can set true, right prices, because only markets reflect the true nature of supply and demand and the true wishes and rational actions of market participants. What the Fed does is it tries to project or predict what those would be, but it can't. That's the failure of central planning. Central planning cannot determine what my values are, cannot determine at what interest rate I should want to lend or borrow money. So they cannot set interest rates. Any interest rate they set is wrong. It's either too high or too low. It's just wrong. So what the Fed did yesterday is wrong. I don't understand why they raised it, but I don't understand why it was where it was before. And neither do they. This is true voodoo economics. And the only true interest rates, the only correct price for interest rates is that set by the marketplace. Free of Federal Reserve manipulation, free of central planning, of government interference and government regulations. So, and I think this expectation of a low growth rates and the fact that anything above this, they then fear inflation and they start raising interest rates. It's just destructive, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The self-fulfilling prophecy is low growth rate, because every time the growth rate gets very high, they're going to crush it with high interest rates. So there's no winning here, and this is the evil and danger of central planning. The Federal Reserve, is an unmitigated disaster in my view. Unmitigated disaster. Hey, Thank you, Robert Marshall, for doing a super chat and contributing $5. By the way, you can go on YouTube and use super chat to contribute. Instead of Patreon, you can use super chat on YouTube to contribute to the Yaron Book Show. The money goes to the same place it goes with Patreon to help promote and to market the Yaron Book Show out there. So any of you who would like to do that, $1, $5, $10, $100, you can do it right now on YouTube, and of course you can also go to Patreon and support me there, and that would be great. Every day I add a few people. Every day it's growing. We're up to I think 210 or something like that. I like to see it grow every single day. So please go out there today. Some of you who have not maybe joined the Patreon campaign, go out there today, make a contribution. It'll make my evening going back to my computer and seeing, oh, another 2 people have contributed something. And if that happens every day and we continue at this pace, we will have plenty of money about a year from now. We'll have plenty of supporters. You know, what we need is the slow growth, but consistent growth, so that we have plenty of money to really promote and advocate for this campaign. You're not paying my salary. You're not paying to buy my big screen TV. What you are paying for is the marketing of the show and the improved technical quality of the show. So, for example, sound quality has gone up significantly over the last couple of shows, and that's because I bought a preamp recommended by Chris. I bought it. He showed me how to set it up, and now the sound quality and the $100 that the preamp cost came out of the Patreon funds that you guys have contributed. All right, we've got a couple of callers now. Hi, you're in the Yaron Brook Show. Who's this?
Hello?
Yes, you.
Hello, me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Russell. Thanks for picking up my call.
Sure.
My question is, sorry. My question is, the Fed and the government has obviously set us up for the worst crash since the Great Depression. Do you think they're ever going to just flat out admit that they've made a whole bunch of mistakes and that we're doomed?
No, of course not. They never do that. I mean, why would they? They didn't do that when the Great Depression happened. They never admitted to making a mistake. It took economists years afterwards to say, yes, the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression, but they've never really admitted it. And they Bernanke, when he headed up the Federal Reserve, is a scholar of the Great Depression, and he knows that the Federal Reserve, to a large extent, caused the Great Depression. And then he did basically the same mistakes, committed a lot of the same mistakes that the Fed did back then. They will never admit it. They hold on to power with everything that they have. They hold on to their own power with everything that they have. And no, they will not. And Donald Trump will never admit it. He would never admit a mistake, period. And he certainly wouldn't admit a mistake of this magnitude, this not loser, but just nothing that he appointed the chairman of the Federal Reserve. I mean,
right.
It's nothing. So, yeah, they're setting us up for big collapse. Now, whether it be collapse like the Federal Reserve, or not, like the Great Depression or not, I'm out of the business of making those kind of predictions. But there's no question that you cannot engage in the kind of monetary policy that we have for the last 10 years. And then you cannot run up the kind of debts that the United States government and the Japanese government and the European governments have without there being substantial and hurtful consequences down the road. I still think that one of the things that is bailing us out and reducing the consequences or pushing them out further into the future is the fact that China and emerging markets are growing the economies, are producing, are creating, and are saving, which is basically providing increased productivity on a global level, which is mitigating a lot of the negative effects that have been created by the horrible monetary policy of the developed world, Bank of Japan, the U.S. Fed, and the European Central Bank. But soon that might go away because soon the Trump administration might be clamping down on all of that. Somebody's asking on. Okay, thanks for calling. I really appreciate it. Somebody's asking on Facebook a question. It's too good and juicy for me not to answer. Do you think that Leonard Peikoff is wiser than you? Leonard Peikoff is 100 times smarter than me. Leonard Peikoff knows philosophy a million times better than I do. He's in many things wiser than me. In some things, I'm wiser than him. But generally, like I don't know, what do you say? He's a superstar. He's my hero, and he's got a mind that I can only dream of having. He's close to being a genius. I'm not. And in terms of philosophy, there's no competition. But there's certain issues, particularly related to the practicalities of life, that I'm probably wiser than him, if that means anything. All right. We got one more caller. Hi, you're on the Yaron Brook Show. Who's this?
Aloha, it's Stuart.
Hey, Stuart. Been a long time.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about something that I want to ask you if it bothers you. So I greatly appreciate how Ron Paul has brought a lot of attention to the Federal Reserve and it's devaluing the currency. But a lot of things about the end of the Fed movement worry me.
Yep.
Lots of people in it talk about how bankers are just congenitally statist.
Yep.
They use a slur called bankster.
Yep.
And they keep citing this website called Zero Hedge that spreads all of these New World Order conspiracy theories. So I wanted to ask you your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, Zero Hedge is a huge mixed bag. I mean, it's got a few people there who are decent, and then some weird conspiracy theory nuts. I was very much appalled by Ron Paul's audit the Fed and audit the Fed and end the Fed, because it didn't strike me as he was providing an alternative to that. And most of the people who support the end the Fed movement, or a lot of people support the end the Fed movement, would like the Treasury Department to print money, to take over the responsibility of the Federal Reserve, which I think would be a massive disaster. Or the idea of audit the Fed, as if we don't know what the Fed does. We know very well what the Fed does. But the disaster of audit the Fed would be that the Congress now starts centrally planning for the central planners at the Fed, which would be another disaster. It's bad enough that we have stupid economists at the Fed doing what they do, but now to have even stupider congressmen telling these bad economists what they should do. I mean, that's evil upon evil. So my solution to the Fed is free banking. It's completely deregulated bank system where the bankers issue money, issue currency, which they do based on some reserve that they have, whether it's gold or whether it's something else. Let the market decide. But I believe in markets. Most of these and the Fed guys believe in conspiracy theories. They think the Fed is a private bank, which is bizarre and ridiculous and silly. The chairman of the Fed is appointed by the president and approved by Congress. The profits of the Fed makes profits many years, go to the Treasury departments, not to the banks that are supposedly nominally its shareholders. Everything about the Fed it's a government institution, and it's a government. It's relatively independent, like many regulatory agencies are relatively independent. But at the end of the day, its goals are set by Congress. It's got this dual mandate set by Congress. It has to keep inflation low and keep unemployment low as well. So it's got the mandate was set by Congress. That makes it a government entity. In every respect, it's a government entity. But these people use the Fed as if it's a conspiracy theory about these are private bank, as you said, banksters who are manipulating everything and controlling everything. Now, this is really, really bad stuff that is promoted by leftists and by subjectivist libertarians and by conspiracy theory nuts, a combination of all three. And I'm very much opposed to it. Ending the Fed. The focus should not be on ending the Fed. The focus should be on what the alternative is, and that is bringing about freedom in banking. That's the solution. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks for pointing that out. And absolutely, I share with you the distrust and hatred of those guys. All right, I'm running out of time, and I've got one more caller. So I think, if I got one more caller, yes. Let me take this call, and then this will be it. So please don't call in. Hi, you're on the Yaron Brook Show. Who's this?
Hi, Yaron. It's Jonathan Honig.
Oh, hey, Jonathan. How are you?
Hi. I know you're running out of time. I'll make it very quick. You had mentioned your inability to decipher the Fed. It reminded me of something that I'd heard Harry Binswanger said, in which he had said that there was no economics of non-market systems. My sense is you'd probably agree with that.
That's right. I mean, you can't really, and this is the problem, is that you can't really, I mean, what economics can tell you is that what the Fed is doing is distorting. And maybe really, really, really good economists who really have really deep understanding could tell you in what way it's distorting, although that's really, really hard to do. But yes, there's nothing more you can do about that other than identify, I think, that it's distorting, that it's perverting, that it's creating a bad stuff out there. And to actually, and this is the problem we have as investors, is, okay, but what do we do with that, right? I mean, it's frustrating because we know it's causing something bad, but how to play it in the market is very, very difficult. And I know that you and I both talked about this in the past, that sometimes you see the Fed doing something that you know is going to result in some negative consequence, but it's so long-term and it's so unclear in which area it will actually happen that you can't trade it and you can't make money at it, which is frustrating. So I'm trying to think of a good analogy, and I'm not coming up. I'm going to have to try to think of a good analogy for what the Fed does. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just thank you for doing the news briefings. I like Yaron the News. I'll just throw that out there as an idea. But I'm going to be upping my support on Patreon and wishing you Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and thank you for all that you do.
I appreciate that. Merry Christmas to you. If I don't see you before, or we don't talk before the end of the year, Happy New Year. And Happy New Year and Merry Christmas to all of you listeners. Thank you, Jonathan, for upping your contribution, and thank you for all of you who are going to go tonight and start contributing, and for all of you who already have contributed. I really appreciate it. This has been a long show, 50 minutes, a little longer than I wanted, but cool. I'm hoping you're enjoying the new format. Lots of fun stuff and new stuff to come in the new year. And you've been listening to the Yaron Brook Show. And we will talk on Saturday when I do The Blaze. Talk to you then. Bye.